And now I would, say thank you to Tom. I'd like to invite a man who literally wrote the book on Kildare GAA, the centenary year history of Kildare GAA from 1984. He's a man familiar to those who listen to the national airwaves, but he assures me he is back to his happy place today. A man who interviewed Larry on many occasions as a young sports journalist, Mr. Owen Curry.
I'm still a young sports journalist. Rwy'n magad an brodiwr fe harash ma conte duchas in Conte Kildare to commemorate and give homage to a man whose name commands so much authority that when I joined sports journalism and the all-time, there was All-Star Awards every year where 15 hurlers, 15 football players got awards. But when the very first all-time All-Star was proposed by Mick Dunn, the late Mick Dunn, it was the very first name that came out as we argued around the table, and there was no resistance to it. It was Larry Stanley. As a young sports journalist, I started in Rathmines in 1978. It was quite a sport. There was only 20 of us. There was only one journalism school at the time, and there was quite a sporty group. It was Desi Cahill, myself, and Vincent Hogan all identified each other as big sports fans, and we hung around together. I also was staying with my Auntie Peggy. My Auntie Peggy would have no interest in sport, and being named in a sporting event would really be surprising to her, my late Auntie Peggy, in Larkfield Grove. And I did find out quickly that Larry Stanley lived nearby between Rathmines and Rathgar. So I got my spirally notebook and my pen and my very basic shorthand. I was only learning it. And I knocked on the door, and the first thing I saw was the name Cara on the door. And that is Larry lived out of Kildare all his life, but his heart was still back here. He welcomed me with open arms. The first thing he said to me was, "You're a fit young fella, would you be able to play for Kildare? We need to start winning." He'd obviously never seen me play. He also got me a typewritten 3-page document on how to play Gaelic football. He wanted Kildare to start winning again. He wanted the Sam Maguire to be back in the county. And I assured him in 1978 it wouldn't be long. He talked a lot about his childhood here. The team that he first played for was called Black Trench. There aren't any Black Trenches, but the Black Trench, for people who remember the bog before it became illegal, there was a trench with the water still in it. And if you go out the Newbridge Road and turn right and you go about a mile, you go to the townland of Black Trench. That was the name of the club. They won a junior. Larry was on the team. Some of his brothers were on the team. And out of that, it didn't last very long. It was decimated by emigration and the sort of transitional movement of bog workers at the time. Out of that came his relationship with Kildare football, which he didn't play very often, but very, very importantly, he was the heart of that 1919 team. As Tom said, the Leinster final, which is the first time I think that Kildare were described as the Lily Whites in a national newspaper. That was his key match, and Dublin were expected to win, or were on the ascendant, as they always are. What happened afterwards was that he moved to Dublin. A lot have said, why didn't he play in the meantime? You couldn't. Until the Declaration Rule in 1925, which caused havoc with the All-Ireland series of that year, you couldn't actually declare for a native county. You could in 1926, which was his return. What he had done in the meantime was become very much part of this noble group of gentlemen here, the Garda Síochána. Quite controversial. I see some of my local history colleagues here, Seamus Cullen, I see Tom from Mullingar, people like that who are into the conflicted history at the time. The Garda Síochána establishment in the middle of the Civil War had been very difficult because we had a very divided political situation. The Garda, to their enormous credit of those early commissioners, kept a sound middle ground. And one of the ways they did it was by expounding the sporting prowess of the Gardaí. Another Kildare man, George McGann, would be involved in that. Larry was at the heart of that. Larry's participation in the Olympics, 1924, it's 100 years ago, and we have Peter Sherrod, the CEO of the Olympic Council here. 100 years ago, we first participated in the Olympics. We didn't even have an anthem. they came up with Let Erin Remember the Days of Old, and that was going to be the anthem for the Olympics, because there wasn't a designated official state one at the time. And Mitchell Cogley, does anyone remember Mitchell Cogley? He wrote for The Independent, and his son Fred became the director of programmes of sport in RT, and his grandson as well. He was there, and he was very young, he was about 14, with his father, and he got to carry the Irish flag. Normally an athlete does that. So that was all put together. I think the first athlete to put on a green singlet with the Irish colours on it, that we celebrated so much at the European Championship. Brian Dowling is just from Athletic Federation, just back from the European. He doesn't say he wasn't actually running, although he's in a position to claim credit for some of those great achievements last week. But the first time a green singlet was worn in the Olympics may have been by Larry. I think he was one of the first into the field. Disappointed with it. He talked about it years later. He's still disappointed, and he finished 10th. There was hopes for the medal. Irish athletes had dominated, particularly the throwing events, pre-independence, competing in English and American colours. We didn't come home with a medal. We came home with a literary and an artistic. There were sort of peripheral competitions. We did come fourth in one of the things, and one of the boxers could have won a bronze. But it was a little bit disappointing. But as Tom says, the Tailteann Games captured Dublin imagination in 1924 for loads of reasons. Part of it being the fact we were newly independent, we had peace at last, the last of the internees were being, the anti-treaty internees were being released, and a huge crowds gathered to the Tailteann Games, and Larry was beaten by the Olympic champion very narrowly. He could have got a silver in Paris, but that was not to be. Was he thinking about the 1928 Olympics? No doubt. Absolutely. Didn't go into it much. The decathlon would have been the event. He was quite an all-rounder, and maybe that explains why when he got bruised up by a Kerry man who shall remain nameless, but at the 1926 drawn match, didn't play in the replay, he was probably protecting himself for athletics and possibility of 1928. Years and years later, he had quite an involvement in Kildare football as coach. He was involved with his nephew. I know Pat Dunny is here, the legendary Kildare footballer and hurler. He will remember Larry's nephew all too well, Jim Clark, who was a great character on the field and was a great character off the field. He was involved in many a county board tussle with Pat and with others. Jim Clark, by the way, Larry was always a gentleman on the field. And you know the way opposites sort of come from the same family? Jim Clark has the distinction, and I may be alone in the history of the GAA, have in the distinction of having been banned for life twice. He was banned for life, he was let back in again, and he hit someone else and got banned again. My interview with Jim Clark was just before he was out death 2 years ago, and it was very different from the one from the 1984 book, in that he felt he was sinned against more than sin. Once you have a reputation, it's very hard to get rid of it. He also said that Larry was too soft, that when he was a coach, he wasn't aggressive enough. And the 1956 Kildare team, the last one to win a Leinster before 98, Larry had an input at that in the dressing room, and he gave the pre-match motivational speeches, things like that. Interestingly enough, my conversation with Larry was, he would say that the modern Kildare team, we're talking about the 70s, weren't aggressive enough. So it wasn't that he was someone who was against the competitive spirit, because that shows all through his own career and his achievements. I would love to have those 2 hours in Larry Stanley's company back again to ask him 200 or 300 more questions. But I do think that he would love to be here to see his name being commemorated, but he wouldn't be a man for the podium. He'd be probably standing back with his family and taking the compliments, smiling a little bit, and longing in his heart to see Kildare back on the podium, holding up the Sam Maguire. Go to Mina Malgif, Galer.